Welcome, everyone, to the HeroX Innovation Leadership Speaker Series. I'm Jamie Elliott. I'm joined today by Morgan Swink. Morgan is from the Center for Supply Chain Innovation at Texas Christian University. Morgan, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you here. Please tell us about yourself, about your innovation journey so far.
Hey, it's a real pleasure to be with you today. And I love talking about innovation in all sorts of ways. My own personal experience, I started out in engineering. I thought I wanted to be an English teacher, but I got a scholarship to be an engineer. So I did that instead. And I got a job with Texas Instruments here in Dallas, Texas, where I grew up. And I got into product development projects. And I really got the bug creating new designs, thinking about how to solve problems in a product development context, not just the product, but how the product is made, the production of the product, where are we going to get the parts from, that whole end-to-end innovation process, right? Not just the design, but the delivery as well. So that kind of fired my imagination a little bit. I had this interest in being a teacher, as I said. And so I finally kind of made the jump to get a PhD in operations management, mainly because I'd had a lot of experience in product development, but also manufacturing through TI. And one thing led to another. I thought I was going into a teaching career, but it actually, and I do teach, but it turned out that research is a really important part of a professor's mission. I'm in a business school here at TCU that's a very strong research environment. I worked at a couple of other universities before I ended up back here in Texas, but along the way, I've just really loved being able to spend time answering questions that I think are important in whatever ways I can, usually involving data and analyzing data. And then, with that, I mean, to round out my career, I've been able, since I joined Texas Christian here about 15 years ago, to start a center. It's called the Center for Supply Chain Innovation, where we try to promote projects with companies who are trying to solve problems. Again, could be labor problems, could be technology oriented problems, organizational issues, all in the supply chain space. And then we try to develop really innovative programs and curriculum for our students, our supply chain students here at TCU as well.
Very, very interesting. I love the connection of all these different things, right? Engineering, teaching, and research, but then also product development and how supply chain can affect all of those. I'm curious about the innovation aspect. It's the Center for Supply Chain, not development, not logistics, it's supply chain innovation. So how do you innovate differently?
Yeah. So we picked that name very intentionally. There are centers like ours around other schools, and they're usually supply chain excellence or something like that. But our group here, faculty, is very technology oriented, and so it made sense for us to be thinking of ourselves as innovators and trying to attract company partners who also are very interested in innovation. But again, we try to define that pretty broadly. Yes, we want to try to help them solve business problems innovatively and even evaluate technology options, which is a lot of what we're doing these days. There's so much going on, of course. Uh, whether we might as well go ahead and say AI, get that out there, but AI or all the other technology advances that are going on. But again, part of that innovation mission is to try to be innovative in terms of the curriculum with students as well. And TCU is a very high touch experiential learning is a big part of our mission and vision for what we deliver. We generally have very small classes, a lot of interaction with students. So it's a great environment to try to do new things. And I can tell you about a couple of the programs we've got coming up that are kind of exciting, I think, from an innovation standpoint. But yeah, we're trying to be innovative in lots of different ways, programmatically in terms of our own research that we're doing, and then also working with companies.
That's very cool. I do see these pockets in some university ecosystems where this experiential learning and research with academic advisors or professors really becomes more prominent. And it's so cool to watch. We got to do a challenge with NASA called What's on the Moon,
Mhm.
where It was about designing and building solutions that could transmit and store electricity that is generated on the lunar surface. And the university teams working in tandem with their professors to build these solutions, come up with these solutions, and how much the student teams themselves were doing was so inspiring. And going back to that supply chain piece, the students ending up designing a battery themselves and creating a battery
Wow.
because they knew what they needed. They knew for their transmission and storage solution, and couldn't find exactly what they needed on the market as quickly as they could figure out and solve the problem, and build it. It was, yeah, and for something that needs to go get tested in a NASA vacuum chamber. So yeah,
Mhm.
I'd love to hear about the programs that you've got going.
So we have a similar. So what you just described, I think, is it's really exciting, and you see a lot of engineering schools who have capstone type projects like that with companies, and they're usually around designing some kind of a technology solution or that's really cool. You know what you talked about in terms of energy and management on the moon and things like that. Of course, we're in a business school here, so we're trying to solve problems that are more, I guess you might call them administrative problems or organizational problems. But we've launched a new capstone project course, very similar to the engineering style, where we work with a company. This is actually a full on consulting type engagement. So it's not just students, but a faculty member who is linked with a student team and assigned to a company. We develop a statement of work, deliverables, all the kind of normal things you would see in a regular consulting engagement. And we're launching that this year. Actually, this next semester will be our first launch of that scale of projects. And we have 9 projects lined up that include everything from trying to bring AI to solve some very complicated scheduling type of problems. And actually, this is the kind of cool thing. You know, lots of companies are investigating ways to apply, whether it's Gen AI or agentic AI or different levels of AI capability. Some of these students are actually on the front edge of this. I mean, they're on the leading edge of using these tools and developing and coding some of these solutions. So we're able to bring that expertise to some of these projects. We've got a couple of other projects that are dealing with the current globalization situation. We have one project with the free trade zone here in Alliance, Texas, just north of Fort Worth, where we're looking at countries and companies in those countries who are looking to make foreign direct investments in the US, basically motivated by a lot of the trade tensions and issues that are going on right now. And so helping that free trade zone plan for development and partnerships with those companies. So we're trying to help identify who those companies are, what their value propositions for the free trade zone would be with them and with domestic partners. So that's an organizational innovation or kind of supply chain oriented innovation. So the projects run the gamut, really lots of different kinds of things, most of which are responding to the current opportunities and challenges, whether that's economic or technological changes that are
Right.
happening.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I don't know if you see it this way as well, but it seems there's potentially a shift in the knowledge landscape, right? And where not necessarily where the new ideas come from, but maybe where we learn things, right?
Yeah.
Big forward thinking companies may not have the fastest R&D anymore, and they may need to look elsewhere to figure out what should I be doing about my automation problems? How should I be solving that right now and for a scalable future? And so it makes sense to keep all options open and to look to your own internal team, but also to look to a university partner, for example. It's
Yeah, exactly.
really
We
interesting.
definitely we want to be part of that ecosystem.
Yeah.
Consultants have been around forever, of course, and different trade groups or government groups, that fund innovation projects and things like that. So we want to be part of that. And it turns out that, as you said, some of the kind of leading edge thinkers are not the scientists who've been doing things for many, many years, but because of the rapidity of change, and technology development that's happening all over, sometimes students can be really great sources of innovation and knowledge and cutting edge
Yeah,
thinking.
absolutely. I think what you're doing at the center is inspiring because it's doing all these things that we've already talked about with that business flair that you mentioned, right? With giving them practical skills, um, like you said, to develop a statement of work or create a work breakdown structure and turn that into a project plan.
Right.
Really, really powerful. You mentioned to me that you have some other research projects going on as well.
Yeah. So I'll mention one other thing our center does, and then I can talk about some of the kind of personal
Yeah.
research as a researcher that I'm into. But we also have, you might call it a hackathon. It's a big case competition that we sponsor every year. A little bit different target, but still very innovation oriented in its overall objectives. We invite, this is graduate level, so we invite teams from graduate schools all over the country to send teams for a weekend. We write up a case challenge with a company partner. It's a real world specific challenge. And then we invite those teams to come in and work on that for 24-hour period and then come up with the best solutions they can propose. And we have judges, good judges from usually around 60 to 70 executives from all over, mostly Dallas Fort Worth area, but also other areas to come in and evaluate those. The company partner will come in and talk about the quality of the solutions that they saw and bring some more nuance to it. So it's a great learning experience, but also develops. This is our eighth year to do that, and we've come up with some solutions that I think companies have really valued through that process. On a personal front, I have a wide range of interests, but right now, what's really kind of motivating a lot of interest is uh, the changing landscape in terms of buyer and supplier relationships and supply chain networks and everything that's happening. I mentioned earlier, trade changes in the trade regimes and tariffs and all that kind of stuff, and everybody's scrambling to try to understand how that affects their overall network structure. So I have a couple of different projects looking at that. I published a paper last year that looked at the last trade war in the first Trump administration term and what the implications of that were for innovation in China and in the US in terms of, did that uncertainty, we have this construct that we call trade policy affect uncertainty. And basically, we can measure that uncertainty through annual reports and what companies are talking about in analysts meetings and things like that. And then see how did that actually impact their investment profiles in terms of R&D spend and patent development, things like that. And as you might have guessed, it's pretty suppressive. It was especially on the Chinese side, a lot less investment, a lot of postponed investment in innovation because of that original trade war, which was 8 years ago. And so now we're seeing the same thing happening again. A lot of postponed investments, not just in product development and R&D, but also capital expenditures and other kinds of things. So that's one big study that we're looking at, trying to capture that, document the impact of that. The other kind of broad range that I'll just throw out, maybe for interest, is to look at how different players in the supply chain ecosystem influence innovation between partners. So if you look at just about any industry, but pick like automotive industry, a large percentage of the innovation for an OEM, like a Ford or a Tesla or a GM or whatever, a lot of the most of the innovation comes from the supply base. It's done in the first tier, second tier suppliers. They're the ones who are doing most of the developmental work, right? Suppliers they're incentivized to innovate, but it's risky for them to invest in innovation, right? So what we're looking at is how do third parties who are tangentially involved in these buyer supplier relationships, how do they either lessen the risk or heighten the risk of innovation investment from a supplier? So just to give you a quick example, we've got a paper coming out now that shows that in the financial markets, you have analysts, right, who follow companies and write reports on companies and make earnings projections for companies. And we found that if you have an analyst that follows both the buyer and supplier in a buyer supplier relationship, these analysts who follow both the buyer and supplier can act as information intermediaries. Basically, they can bring more information to the supplier through their reports and also through informal communications that that give the supplier more information about what the buyer's doing, and so it lessens the risk. So bottom line is we have this huge database of buyer supplier pairs, and we can tell whether or not these pairs have analysts following both of them or just one of them. And in the case where the analysts are following both of them, we see a net increase, almost 33% higher investment in R&D, relationship specific investment, suppliers making more investment for their buyers' needs when those analysts are there, just because of the risk reduction that is provided through the information that's provided through these analysts. That's kind of a complicated thing. Hope that made sense to you. But we're looking at analysts. We're looking at who owns stock in both the buyer and the supplier. Politicians who might own stock in a buyer and have suppliers in their district. All these regulators of all kinds, watchdog groups, all these different third party stakeholder groups, and how they can influence innovation between buyers and suppliers. It's really fascinating, and the effects are actually surprisingly large. Things that we hadn't thought about before. Does that make sense?
It does. I have more questions
Yeah.
because it would seem this is an assumption,
Yeah.
and I'm being introduced to the topic. It would seem that if that supplier's information about the buyer is presented to them in a way that gives them a favorable outcome, gives both parties a favorable outcome from the analyst, information from the analyst, then it could also equally benefit the buyer. Like you said, they're getting more from their supplier.
Yeah.
Their supplier's investing more. But if that then increases the capability and the capacity of the supplier, then that buyer is now more informed about what that supplier is capable of, and therefore could say, well, then your competitors should be able to do that as well. And I have more information. I could go to these other competitors and say, hey, this supplier is able to do this for us. Can you do this as well?
Yeah.
Right?
That's another research question. We haven't looked at that, but what's the spillover effect is what we would call that,
Right.
right? What's the
Okay.
spillover effect to the buyer's other suppliers? Does that put more pressure on them to compete? So what we looked at specifically was what I called relationship specific innovation. And the way we measured that was suppliers who create patents that cite the patents of the buyer,
Yeah.
and or they have patents that are in the same technological categories. There's a lot of ways to categorize patents that are as the buyer, same categories, right? And again, we're just looking at pairs, what we call dyads, buyer supplier pairs.
Okay.
But the spillover effects for the larger supply base, there's definitely potential for those kinds of effects. And that would be something else we could try to look at.
It seems like there'd be a lot of interdependency. There's a lot of potential for error or noise. But but
Yeah, this is
if
a this is an average effect we're talking about, right? So not
okay,
every
okay.
time, but yeah, but it's just across a
Yeah.
large data sample, we see that on average, we see this net increase in supplier investment in relationship specific innovation.
And how independent is the analyst to that relationship?
Yeah. Well, they're supposedly acting as neutral third parties, independent parties, and they're not only following these two companies, right? So typical analysts might follow a dozen different companies and write about those companies.
Right.
But that's a good question too. I mean, that probably varies from relationship to relationship. Sometimes finance researchers have done a lot of research on the roles of analysts and how directly or indirectly they are involved with the companies that they follow, right? So that varies quite a bit as well.
Now, the first thing I thought of about the analyst is it would also depend on that analyst's timeliness, how thorough they are with their analysis. This is a really interesting tangent.
Tons of variation, right? So
Yeah.
what we're all about in this kind of research. So this is what we'd call this econometric research. We're trying to look at the drivers of innovation with large data sets, and there's a lot of noise in there. But what we're trying to find is where's the signal? Is there signal that's strong enough to come through the noise? And that's what we found, statistically speaking, with this kind of thing. But that's one study, quick study that's kind of in the same vein. And that kind of gets at your point about the spillover. is we looked at companies and their supply bases, not just the individual supplier now, buyer supplier, but a company that has a supply base. We look at that supply base. First of all, how concentrated is it? Meaning, given the spend that they have, the size of the company, the sales, how many suppliers do they have? And then, do those suppliers, are they overlapped in the sense that do those suppliers then serve other customers that are their competitors, the buyer's competitors? And or do they serve customers that are outside the industry? So we call that outreach. So you have
Sure.
overlaps, suppliers that have overlap, suppliers who have outreach. That, and then we say, okay, if we look at those supply structure variables, concentration, overlap, outreach, how do they relate to the buyer's innovation in terms of its innovation efficiency? How many patents per R&D dollar, and innovation diversity. How many different kinds of patents, variety of patents. And some of it's pretty intuitive. Like if I asked you, would overlap improve efficiency or reduce efficiency? Think. So I have a supplier who serves me, but also serves my competitors in terms of improving my innovation efficiency. What do you think? Maybe it's not so intuitive.
I honestly don't know.
Yeah. Well, the idea is okay, if you're serving customers that are your suppliers serving your competitors, there's going to be spillover, right? So you're going to have the potential to learn, maybe even
Okay.
accidentally, if not, you're going to get that benefit in terms of innovating in the same space that you're already innovating in, and your competitors
Right.
are. You're going to gain that benefit, right? So it improves
Yeah.
efficiency. But if you want innovation diversity, right? You want to do new thing, really new thing. Well, then you need those suppliers that are linked to extra industry customers. I want suppliers who are working with other customers who are doing completely different things that I'm doing,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
But then the interesting thing, not to get too much in the weeds here, but the concentration variable interacts, right? So if I really want to be good at diversity of innovation, I don't want concentration. I want a dispersed supply base, and I want a lot of suppliers that are also not overlapped, but outreach to other industries, right? But if I want efficiency, I would actually like to have a very concentrated supply base, because the fewer suppliers I'm dealing with, the more relational capital I can develop with them, and the more systems that we can co-invest in, and just to make innovation a lot more efficient and collaboration a lot easier to do, right? It's harder the transaction cost of doing that with many, many different suppliers in a very unconcentrated supply base is really costly. I
We
might have
might.
confused you more than helped you with that.
No, no.
These are the kind of things
I'm
we're looking at.
thinking. I'm thinking we might need to do like a series of this series because there's a someone I've gotten to work with. We study these things in terms of a knowledge graph, and if you think about innovation on a knowledge graph, right? What you're talking about with suppliers supplying things to people who are using them for the same product for completely different things, right? The concept of the adjacent possible
Yeah.
is discovering true novelty,
Okay,
true
great.
innovation, true invention is when there's buzz about something and about a certain topic, and it's getting more and more busy until someone says, wait, I can do this. This doesn't exist yet. And now we've reached that point. And it makes sense in that knowledge graph kind of way that if I'm doing this, if I'm doing X with product one and someone else is doing Y with product one, that connection between them allows me to reach that novelty by connecting those dots and say, well, if you could do that with it, then I could maybe do this with it, right? It's it's what you do with recipes in the kitchen, right? Well, maybe I could try this. What can I substitute until you create something completely new?
Yeah. So take that knowledge graph idea and think of it as a social network now among partners or
Right.
potential partners,
Right.
direct partners and indirect partners. That's what we're, in fact, we have a thing called social network theory that guides a lot of these expectations. What does your supply network look like? And what do their supply chain networks look like? And then what did their networks look like? And ultimately, you've got this huge network that represents knowledge flows, just
Right,
like
and
the
that's
knowledge
yeah,
growth. And
the
that's what you're trying to
yeah,
manage.
the underlying aspect of that is information, right?
Yeah.
It's and the sources of that information. All right. We
So just to give you a taste, but yeah, we've got lots going on here at TCU, and some of my colleagues are doing similar kinds of studies, all with the aim of trying to understand how does innovation happen? How can we make it more efficient, effective, novel? All those different goals that you have for innovation,
Very cool.
both in
This
the
is
business world and in the
fantastic.
education world.
Yeah, I'd love to share your research with our listeners and with our viewers. For anyone who is a student of these things, or for anyone who is a professor or researcher of similar fields, trying to help others learn about innovation or learn about different ways to innovate, what advice would you have for them?
Yeah, well, I have to make the analogy to, buyer supplier networks. It's knowledge networks, right? So in academia, we have pretty well established ways to communicate with each other through conferences and all kinds of study groups and networks and things. I guess you can be over networked. The transaction cost gets too high, right?
Yeah.
But my main advice would be just to find people who have similar energy and enthusiasm and interests, but try not to be too siloed in your choices of partners or networks to be involved in. Go get involved in something that, as you mentioned, whether it's tangential or something truly novel. Get involved with partners that will help you do what you do now more efficiently, but also get involved every now and then with somebody who is just, somebody across campus in English or economics or certainly engineering, of course. But, any of those areas, I find those kinds of conversations to be really stimulating. And sometimes you get really good ideas,
Yeah,
from those kind of connections.
I agree. This whole thing spawned out of just the fact that I like listening to what other people do for work, and now we get to showcase that. It's really really impactful stuff. One other question, think this is an assumption, but I think that many people didn't know the definition of supply chain 6 years ago, and COVID and the effects of that on our economies taught us what supply chain is. And you've talked about the most recent developments in supply chain and the economy with the tariffs and the trade wars. How has this landscape shift looked from your perspective, having been in this for more time than most of us in your career?
Yeah. Yeah. It's really been, I feel very lucky, fortunate, blessed, however you want to say it, to have kind of come along when I did in my career. Especially the academic part, which I started about 30 years ago. I've kind of ridden this wave, just like globalization happened in the last 30 years. That's why we have supply chains. That's why it's such a big topic now. 30 years ago in the 90s or earlier, if you looked at business schools, many of them had departments of operations, manufacturing, internal operations, right? But as the world globalized and as companies outsourced and we started to grow these long, intricate, synchronized, connected supply chains for multiple reasons. Cost is one, right? Chasing a lot of low cost sources and things like that, but also quality and just all the richness that comes with globalization. That's happened these early 2000s. Now we're kind of in the opposite. We're contracting, right? So we've gone the other direction. But that whole movement to me is what spawned supply chain. That's why 30 years ago, you had maybe 10 schools that had a supply chain program. Now you've got 300 schools that have a supply chain major. And it's really just followed the overall trajectory of business. And again, of course, COVID came along and really brought the more popular, widespread attention to the term supply chain. It's a terrible term, actually. It's not a chain, it's a network, right? It's not a chain that flows one direction. It flows all over the place, and it's information flows, money flows, and as well as material and people flows. It's a very complex network idea, and it's not just supply; it's demand, right? We're trying to manage demand as well as managing supply. But we're stuck with it, and it is interesting. People, at least now, when I tell them I'm a professor of supply chain, they have some idea what I'm talking about. Whereas before COVID, their eyes would glaze over. So it's a fascinating area. If anybody's interested in what makes countries wealthy, what makes companies wealthy, what makes people wealthy, I can't take personal responsibility for this, but I'm very happy with the fact that most of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, have been raised out of poverty because of supply chains. Basically, this development of global supply chains and the opportunities that's provided in developing parts of the world. And I hope that continues. I know we're moving in a kind of opposite direction now, but it's a really exciting area, and I'd encourage anybody who's interested to look into it.
That is interesting. All right. If we've talked about the publications, we'll be sure to include links to those as well as to TCU and the center. Any other resources, any other ways that folks can learn more, get involved, connect with you?
Sure. Well, you can post the link to the TCU Neely School of Business, and there's a faculty website there. I have a web page there. And then there's also within that website, there is a link for the Center for Supply Chain Innovation. You can take a look at our programs. We have a very robust advisory board made up of companies all around the country, actually. And welcome to in conversation with anybody who'd like to get involved with us, either in research or in the center, or want to hire our students. Lots of ways to get engaged.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for the time, Morgan.
My pleasure.
This has been really, really insightful, really great. I'm glad we got to go deep there for a bit, and hopefully we'll get to do it again. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jamie. Appreciate it.